On a Thursday morning in early September of 2021, Carolyn Hébert stood at the edge of her apple orchard outside Compton, Quebec, and watched 12 years of careful work begin to collapse in ways she did not yet fully understand. She was 53 years old. She had spent the better part of 2 decades building a mid-scale apple operation in the Eastern Townships that by any reasonable measure should not have worked. She had started with 40 acres of neglected orchard her father had let go fallow in the 1990s, had replanted in stages, had added cold storage in 2009 and a small cider pressing operation in 2014, and had built contracts with 3 regional grocery distributors and a restaurant supply company out of Sherbrooke that moved more of her product in a single autumn than most hobby orchards produced in 3 years. She was not wealthy, but she had built something real on ground that people had told her was not worth building on, and she knew the difference. The problem was the fire blight. Let me tell you what Carolyn had done in the spring of 2020, because you need to understand the ambition before you can understand what went wrong. In March of that year, she had expanded her McIntosh and Cortland blocks by 60%, adding 3 new rows of high-density planting on a lease section she'd been watching for 5 years. The analysis from the Provincial Agricultural Extension had been encouraging. Apple demand in the Quebec market was trending up, the cider segment was growing faster than anyone had predicted, and anyone who had cold storage capacity and reliable volume in the next 2 seasons was going to be in a strong position. The analysis wasn't wrong, exactly. It was incomplete. What nobody had accounted for was a wet spring followed by a warm May with 3 distinct periods of temperatures between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius during bloom. The conditions were, in the clinical language of the plant pathologist who would later confirm what Carolyn already suspected, nearly optimal for Erwinia amylovora. Fire blight. The bacterial infection that enters through the blossoms, moves through the wood, and turns what should be flowering branches into something that looks like it has been held over a flame. By the second week of September, she had walked every row. The new high-density block was showing visible strike on roughly 40% of the trees. The older McIntosh section had scattered infections, and the Cortland block, her most reliable producer, had 3 confirmed cankers that her agronomist had marked with orange flagging tape, which against the green of a Quebec September orchard looked like small warnings that nobody else could read. Her options, as her agronomist had laid them out in a call that Friday morning, were not good ones. She could do aggressive surgical pruning, cutting 30 centimeters below every visible strike, sterilizing tools between cuts, and hope the infections hadn't moved beyond what she could see. The problem was that fire blight moves through the vascular system invisibly. You cannot see where it has gone. You can only see where it has been. And by the time it is visible, it has often already moved further than your cuts can reach. She could apply copper-based bactericides to the unaffected trees to slow the spread, but that window had been 2 weeks ago, during the infection period. Applying now was largely prophylactic for next season, not curative for this one, or she could contact her distributors, tell them her volume for the season was going to be significantly short of contracted amounts, and begin the conversation that no one in agriculture ever wants to begin. The one where you explain that the ground did not cooperate this year and hope that the relationship can absorb it. She was walking the Cortland block on that Thursday afternoon, flagging tape in one hand and a notebook in the other when the truck came up the lane. Let me tell you about Ivan Paradis, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he offered. Ivan was 74 years old, and he had farmed the same 80 acres in Saint-Denis-de-Brompton for 48 years. His orchard sat 11 kilometers north of Carolyn's operation, and the two of them knew each other the way people in the Eastern Townships agricultural community always know each other. Enough to speak at the Coaticook producers' meeting once a year. Enough to wave from a truck. Not enough to have ever sat down together in any serious way. Ivan had come to his land as a young man in 1973, the year his father retired from farming and signed the property over to him and his brother Louis, who had left for Montreal within 4 years and never come back. Ivan had stayed. He had farmed through the market reorganizations of the 1980s, through the hailstorm of 1993 that took most of his crop in a single afternoon, through the late frost of 2012 that cost him 70% of his bloom. He had a reputation in the county not for being brilliant, exactly, but for being someone who had been wrong enough times and right enough times that he no longer confused one for the other. What most people in the area knew, though few thought much about, was that Ivan had been managing fire blight in his orchard since 1981. Not with the commercial protocols, exactly. His methods were not anyone's methods but his own. He had spent 4 decades watching the disease move through his trees, watching where it went and where it stopped, watching which interventions actually changed outcomes and which ones made him feel better without doing much to the orchard. He had a system. Not a published system, not a system that appeared in any extension bulletin or provincial guide. A system built from 40 years of watching the same trees in the same ground in the same microclimate, supplemented by a shelf of older French-language pomology texts he had found at an estate sale in 1988 and had read with the attention of someone who had specific problems and was looking for specific answers. He had been driving past Carolyn's orchard for 2 weeks. Watching. His truck came to a stop at the lane and he got out without hurrying, which was how Ivan did most things. He was a large man who had gotten somewhat smaller with age, wearing work clothes that were clean but had seen considerable work. He walked toward Carolyn with the unhurried movement of someone who had somewhere to be, but was not anxious about getting there. Carolyn looked up from her notebook. She had the expression of someone who had been inside a problem for long enough that they were no longer certain they were thinking about it correctly. Ivan said, in the French-accented English he used when he wasn't sure which language a person preferred, "I've been watching your Cortland block from the road. I think I know what you're looking at." Carolyn told him, briefly. The strikes, the cankers, the agronomist's assessment, the conversations she hadn't yet had with her distributors. She told it without much inflection, the way you tell things when you've been rehearsing them in your head for 2 weeks. Ivan listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You have a rootstock problem underneath a blight problem. They're not the same thing and the treatment for one makes the other worse." Carolyn looked at him. "The rootstock. What did you plant the new block on?" she told him. M9, the standard high-density rootstock, high productivity, early bearing, good for the tight spacing she'd used. Ivan nodded slowly. M9 has no blight tolerance, you probably knew that. But what the extension doesn't tell you is that, under the conditions you had this spring, M.9 root systems express systemic stress differently than the older rootstocks. The vascular uptake patterns are different. The blight isn't just in the wood you can see. It's using the root architecture to move in ways that Geneva or Malling 26 wouldn't allow. He paused. The aggressive pruning your agronomist is recommending will work on the older trees. On the new block, you'll be cutting, and the disease will move faster than your cuts. Not because the protocol is wrong, because it's the right protocol for a different tree. Carolyn said, "The agronomist didn't mention this." Ivan said, without any judgment in his voice, "Most of the current protocols were written for Geneva rootstock. The M9 interaction with fire blight under high inoculum conditions is something the older French literature covers in more detail than the current provincial guides. It's not that your agronomist is wrong. It's that the frame he's using doesn't quite fit your situation. There was a silence. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever had someone describe your problem back to you in a way that made you realize you had been describing it to yourself incorrectly for weeks? It is a specific and not entirely comfortable feeling. It is the feeling of the frame shifting, of understanding that the reason your interventions haven't been working is not that you've been working hard enough, but that you've been working on the wrong version of the problem. Carolyn Hébert was not someone who accepted outside counsel easily. She had built her operation without partners, had made decisions that her father and her brother had both thought were too aggressive, and had been right often enough that her own judgment had become something she trusted in the way you trust a tool you have been using for a long time. Not arrogance, something quieter than arrogance. A settled reliance on her own assessment that made it genuinely difficult to hear someone else's assessment without filtering it through her own. She showed Yvonne the flagged trees. He walked the block slowly, stopping at intervals, crouching once to look at the graft union on a young tree with a particular expression that Carolyn couldn't read. He asked to see her spray records for the spring. He stood for a while at the edge of the high-density block and looked at the row spacing and the training system and asked 2 or 3 questions about irrigation timing that Carolyn answered honestly and that Yvonne received without comment. Then he said, "Come to the end of this row." They walked. At the last tree in the row where the high-density planting transitioned back to an older section of Macintosh on MM111 rootstock, the blight strike stopped almost completely. One flat tree at the transition point. Nothing in the older block adjacent to it. Yvonne pointed at the transition. That's your answer. The disease is moving through the M9 root architecture. Where the rootstock changes, the movement changes. Your agronomist is reading the canopy. You need to read the roots. Carolyn said, so the new block is lost. Yvonne said, I didn't say that. Let me tell you what Yvonne proposed. Because it was not anything Carolyn had been offered by her agronomist or the Provincial Extension Service or the 2 other orchardists she had called in the first week of September. In his orchard in Saint-Denis-de-Brompton, Yvonne had spent the better part of 20 years working with a treatment approach he had developed from a combination of older French pomology literature and his own observation of how fire blight moved through different rootstock systems in his particular microclimate. It involved a specific sequence of interventions, timing of bactericide application, targeted root zone treatment with compounds that were not widely used in commercial Quebec orcharding, but were fully registered and available, and a pruning protocol that worked with the vascular architecture of M9 rather than against it. He had not published this. He had not presented it at the producers' meeting. He had not sought any extension service validation. He had used it on his own trees, in his own situation, because it worked on the problem he actually had, and because the alternative was losing blocks of trees he had invested years in establishing. The protocol was slow. It required attention over several weeks, rather than a single aggressive intervention, and it required the willingness to leave some infected wood in place temporarily, which went against every instinct Carolyn had developed and every protocol her agronomist had described. Carolyn's hired hand, a 29-year-old named Pascal, who had been working the orchard for 3 seasons and who had an agriculture diploma from the Institut de Technologie Agroalimentaire, listened to the description of the protocol with the expression of a young person hearing something that contradicted what they had been taught. Pascal said, if we leave the infected wood in place, we're giving the disease more time to move. That's the opposite of what the protocols say. Evan looked at him without irritation. The protocols say that because on the rootstocks they were written for, that's correct. On M9, under the conditions you've had this spring, the aggressive removal approach disrupts the vascular stress response in a way that actually accelerates systemic movement. It sounds counterintuitive because the textbooks don't cover this specific interaction. Pascal said, "Where is this documented?" Yvonne said, "In a 1979 French pomology journal that your program probably doesn't carry, and in 40 years of watching what actually happens in my orchard. You're welcome to come look." There was a silence that had several things in it. Carolyn said, "Show me what you mean. Let me tell you about the next 3 weeks, because they are the reason this story gets told the way it does among the orchard operators in Compton and Coaticook and Saint-Denis-de-Brompton, at the autumn producers' meetings, and in the parking lots of the Farm Supply Co-op, and in the quiet conversations that happen between people who grow things for a living and understand what it means to watch a season turn against you." Yvonne came to the orchard on a Monday morning. He brought a handwritten protocol, 2 pages in his careful French script with a diagram of the M9 vascular architecture that he had drawn himself from memory, and 3 products that Carolyn had to look up because she had never used them. He brought a set of application tools that he had modified over the years for this specific purpose. He moved through the high-density block without rushing. He did not have the energy of a young man. He moved carefully with the deliberation of someone who has learned that careful and slow produces better results than urgent and fast, particularly in orchards, particularly in September. Pascal watched the first day without saying much. Carolyn watched too, and she noticed things. The way Yvonne read the trees, not just the visible strikes, but the overall expression of the tree. The leaf color, the shoot angle, details she looked at every day but had been processing differently. The way he moved through the row. The way he paused at certain trees longer than others, for reasons he sometimes explained and sometimes didn't. On the 3rd day, Pascal came to Carolyn before Yvonne arrived and said, "I looked up that 1979 article. I found a summary of it in a 1983 review paper. He's not wrong about the rootstock interaction," Carolyn said. "No, he's not," Pascal said. "Why doesn't the provincial extension know about this?" Carolyn said. "Maybe they do. Maybe it's not in the standard protocol because the standard protocol has to work for everyone, not just for specific rootstock combinations in specific microclimates in the Eastern Townships." Pascal thought about this for a moment. Then he went back to work. "Let me tell you what happened over the following 2 weeks, because this is where the thing Yvonne had described on that first afternoon became something Carolyn could see with her own eyes rather than take on faith. The high-density block did not get worse. That was the first thing. The blight did not continue to advance through the block the way her agronomist had projected it would. The targeted root zone treatment, applied in the specific sequence and timing Yvonne had described, appeared to interrupt the systemic movement they had both been watching. The second thing was harder to quantify but easier to see. The trees in the treated sections were recovering. Not the severely struck ones. Those were lost, and Yvonne had been clear about which ones those were on the first day and had been right in every case. But the stressed trees, the ones showing early symptoms without confirmed canker, were showing new terminal growth by the 3rd week of September. New growth in September, in a fire blight year, is not something you expect to see. Carolyn had been in orchards for 20 years, and she had not seen it before, and she walked those rows every morning, and she looked at it with the attention of someone who is watching something that contradicts what they thought they understood. By the 1st week of October, she had a number. She had lost 22% of the new high-density block. not the 60 to 70% that the initial assessment had projected. She had lost the severely infected trees, the ones Yvonne had identified on that first Monday, and she had lost 2 additional trees that showed late-developing cankers that nothing could have caught in time. But the rest of the block, 78% of those trees, had come through the season in recoverable condition. The distributors received revised volume estimates that were short but not catastrophic. The restaurant supply company in Sherbrooke called it manageable and confirmed the following season's contract. The cider pressing operation ran at reduced volume but ran. The financial damage, which had looked in early September like something that might require selling the lease section and possibly renegotiating the cold storage loan, was now something Carolyn could carry over 2 seasons without restructuring anything. She drove to Yvonne's farm on a Saturday morning in mid-October. He was in his orchard when she arrived, walking a row of older Spartan trees with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. He turned when he heard her truck and walked over without hurrying. Carolyn said, "I owe you more than I know how to say." Ivan said, "You don't owe me anything." Carolyn said, "I want to pay you. Tell me what's fair." Ivan thought about it the way he thought about most things, quietly, without performing the thinking. Then he said, "There's an orchard mentorship program through the Fédération des producteurs de pommes du Québec. They're trying to connect younger operators with experienced growers. They need funding for travel costs. Whatever you think is fair to that." Carolyn wrote the check that afternoon for $2,000, but that wasn't what she had come for. She stayed 3 hours. She sat at Yvonne's kitchen table, and she asked questions, and Yvonne answered them with the patience of someone who had been holding this knowledge for a long time without anyone asking for it in a serious way. He talked about rootstock biology and how the commercial protocols had been built around the dominant rootstocks of the 1990s and hadn't fully caught up with the shift toward high-density M9 plantings. He talked about the French literature that the Quebec Extension Service had largely not translated or integrated, and about the specific conditions in the Eastern Townships microclimate that made certain problems present differently here than in Ontario or British Columbia. He talked about the winter of 1989 when he had lost a full block of trees to a disease interaction he hadn't understood, and the 3 years he had spent afterward reading and watching and developing the protocol that had saved Carolyn's block. About the mistakes that had taught him more than the successes. About the particular kind of attention that an orchard requires, not the attention of someone looking for what they expect to see, but the attention of someone willing to see what is actually there, which is a different thing and harder to maintain. Carolyn asked, "Why haven't you shared this more broadly? With the Extension Service, with the Producers Association?" Ivan said, "I tried once, in 2003. The response was polite. The protocol doesn't fit into the standard framework because it requires reading individual trees in specific rootstock situations rather than applying a uniform treatment across a block. Commercial agriculture is built around uniform treatments. What I do is not that." He paused. "Also, I'm not a researcher. I have no credentials that make my observations credible to an institution. What I have is 40 years of watching the same trees. That's not the kind of evidence that fits into a report." Carolyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I should have talked to you years ago." He even said, "You wouldn't have listened years ago. You needed to be at the end of your options first." This was true, and Carolyn knew it was true, and she sat with it for a moment without trying to argue with it. Let me tell you what happened in the years after, because the story doesn't end in Carolyn's orchard. Carolyn changed some things about how she operated. Not everything, and not with any announcement. She hired a seasonal consultant, a 66-year-old retired orchardist from the Rougemont area named Bernard Tessier, who had been out of commercial production for 8 years, and who knew things about Quebec apple varieties and Quebec microclimates that the current certification programs did not teach, and who Carolyn found through Yvonne. She started keeping a paper journal alongside her digital monitoring records because she found that writing the observations by hand made her notice things she had been looking at without seeing. She drove up to Saint Denis de Brompton every few months, not for any specific reason, but because she had understood that the education available in Yvonne's orchard was not available anywhere she had looked for it before. Yvonne Paradis died in November of 2023 at the age of 76 in the house he had lived in for nearly 5 decades. The service at the church in Saint Denis de Brompton had 160 people, which was notable for a man who had spent his life working quietly and had never sought any particular recognition from the broader agricultural community. His daughter, Marie-Josée, inherited the farm and the orchard and the shelf of French pomology texts and the handwritten notes that ran to several hundred pages in a series of binders her father had kept in the same back room where he kept his tools. Marie-Josée had grown up on that farm. She had left for university, had worked in environmental consulting in Quebec City for 12 years, and had come back to Saint Denis de Brompton in 2019. The year, her father's health had made it clear that the farm needed another set of hands. She had not planned to stay. She had stayed. And in the years she had worked alongside her father, she had absorbed more of his knowledge than either of them had fully understood until it was tested. She ran the orchard the way her father had run it, not out of sentimentality exactly, but because the methods worked and because she had watched them work for long enough to understand why. Let me tell you about the autumn of 2025, because it is the reason this story is still told. A younger orchardist in Compton, a 34-year-old named Thomas Duval, who had started his operation in 2020 and had expanded aggressively into high-density M9 planting on the same logic that had driven Carolyn's expansion 5 years earlier, found himself in September of 2025 looking at a fire blight situation that his agronomist was describing in terms that removed most of the color from his face. He had heard the story about Carolyn and Yvonne. Everyone in the county had heard the story about Carolyn and Yvonne, but hearing a story and trusting it are different things. And Thomas had grown up in a world of precision agriculture and drone monitoring and provincial integrated pest management protocols, and the idea that the answer to his problem might be a 76-year-old woman's daughter on an old farm in Saint Denis de Brompton with a shelf of French books was not where his mind went first. Carolyn Hébert drove to Thomas Duval's orchard on a Wednesday, uninvited, the same way Yvonne had driven to hers 4 years earlier. She walked his high-density block. She asked about his rootstock. She looked at the graft unions on the young trees in the infected sections and walked to the transition point where his M9 block met an older section on MM1111. She stood at that transition point for a moment. Then she said, "I know someone you need to call." Thomas said, "Who?" Carolyn said, "Marie-Josée Paradis, Saint Denis de Brompton. Her father's protocol is what you need. It's not in any extension bulletin. It won't look like much when you see the materials. Call her anyway." Thomas said, "Is it going to work faster than what my agronomist is recommending?" Carolyn looked at him with an expression she recognized from a conversation she had stood on the other side of 4 years ago. She said, "It's going to work on the problem you actually have instead of the problem the protocol was designed for. That's not the same thing as fast." There was a silence. Thomas Duval called Marie-Josée Paradis that afternoon. Marie-Josée arrived the next morning with the 2-page handwritten protocol her father had written out for Carolyn's orchard in 2021. which Carolyn had returned to Yvonne, and which Yvonne had kept in the binder with the rest of his notes, and which Marie-José had read many times in the years since he died. Thomas's two employees looked at the handwritten pages with an expression that communicated something without saying it. Marie-José moved through the infected block without hurrying. She stopped at the same kind of transition points her father had stopped at. She crouched to look at the same graft unions. She read the trees the way her father had taught her to read them, not for what she expected to see, but for what was actually there, which was the same instruction her father had received from the French texts and the orchard, and from 40 years of paying the kind of attention that cannot be bought and is not taught in any program that Carolyn knew of. Thomas Duval's orchard was not saved entirely. Nothing is ever entirely saved, but enough was saved. Enough trees came through the season. Enough volume reached his distributors. Enough of the operation remained intact that he could look at the following spring as a recovery year rather than a starting over year. Some knowledge is not built to be institutionalized. Some knowledge is built to be carried. In binders on a shelf, in the handwriting of someone who is no longer alive to explain it, in the hands of a daughter who grew up watching her father, read trees the way other people read text, who left and came back, and found that what she had absorbed without trying had turned out to be the most useful thing she owned. The specialists will tell you about integrated pest management. The extension services will tell you about registered protocols and approved application windows. The agronomists will tell you about risk and systemic spread and the importance of uniform treatment across a block, and then the blight will move in ways that the protocol wasn't designed in for, and the options will narrow, and someone will stop at the end of your lane and ask to see your graft unions, and everything will come down to whether you can be quiet enough for long enough to listen to what they are actually telling you. The binders are still on the shelf in Saint Denis de Brompton. Marie-José added 3 pages to them in October of 2025, after Thomas Duval's block, in her own handwriting, with her own observations about what her father's protocol did and didn't account for under the specific moisture conditions of that year. She did not call it an update. She called it a note. Her father would have understood the distinction.